The warning came quietly, almost like a shadow that slipped into the room and refused to leave. Humanity had grown used to strange phenomena in the outer reaches of the galaxy, but nothing like this. The alien who delivered it was called an oracle, a being whose predictions had never failed, whose words carried a weight no one could ignore. He was small in appearance, fragile-looking, yet the confidence in his voice filled the room as if it were a thunderstorm waiting to break. He spoke of a species that had only recently come into prominence, a species humans were just beginning to notice, the core dominion. The oracle didn't exaggerate or dramatize. He simply stated what was inevitable if humans acted without caution. "If you strike first," he said, his eyes almost glowing in the dim light, "they will never halt. No amount of diplomacy or force will stop them once your hand moves first. You will regret it, and you will lose more than you can imagine." The humans listening, military leaders, scientists, and diplomats, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some exchanged skeptical glances. Others frowned, as if weighing the meaning of his words against months of growing tension in the outer systems. The core dominion had been expanding rapidly, absorbing neighboring colonies and pushing forward with technological advancements that humans barely understood. The temptation to strike first, to show strength, was strong, yet the oracle's warning lingered in the room like smoke. It wasn't just that he was right before. It was the certainty in his voice, the calmness that suggested no amount of argument would change the outcome. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply stated a truth that made everyone's stomach twist. The human leaders were aware of his reputation. Others dismissed him, calling him a strange alien mystic who thrived on fear. But deep down, some of them remembered the stories of the last 3 systems, where his predictions had been the difference between peace and total annihilation. The meeting ended with no decision. Humans left the hall with uneasy feelings, some muttering about the need to respond, others insisting that patience and observation were the safer path. Outside, the fleet shuttles hummed quietly as they moved between stations, carrying hundreds of people who had no idea that the fate of their entire species was being debated. In the following days, humans observed the core movements carefully. Scouts reported new structures, new fleets, and new weapons. Each message was measured and factual, but behind every report was a growing unease. Colonies near the contested zones sent frantic messages, asking for more protection, more soldiers, more reassurance. And yet, every time someone suggested a preemptive strike, a part of them remembered the oracle's words. It wasn't easy to ignore the temptation. There were nights when human commanders lay awake in their cabins, staring at the stars and imagining the core fleet approaching. In their minds, waiting seemed dangerous. Perhaps if they acted first, they could save countless lives. Perhaps striking now would prevent a war. That thought was comforting, but also dangerous. The oracle had predicted consequences, not actions. He had no solutions, only foresight. And humans, with all their curiosity and bravery, were often tempted to challenge what they could not control. Discussions grew heated behind closed doors. Advisors argued about strategy, about morality, about what it meant to act before being attacked. Some pointed to historical examples from Earth's wars, where preemptive strikes had sometimes prevented larger conflicts. Others pointed to times when they had created enemies instead of allies. And then, quietly, life continued. In the colonies, people went about their daily routines, farmers tending crops on moons with faint sunlight, engineers repairing satellites, children playing in the safe zones, while parents worried silently about fleets and battles they could not influence. They had no idea that a single choice could ripple across the galaxy, creating consequences that might never end. One evening, as the light from a distant sun glimmered through the windows of the observation deck, a young officer stood watching the stars. She had joined the fleet thinking the galaxy was a place of adventure, of discovery, not politics and impossible choices. But she had learned fast that being part of humanity's frontiers meant carrying a weight far heavier than her own life. The Oracle's warning played in her mind like a loop. She didn't understand the full depth of it, only that it felt urgent, like a wave rising before it broke, that it was then that the first communication from the core dominion arrived. Simple, formal, and without emotion. They requested negotiations, a neutral meeting in a sector far from human colonies. The council debated whether to accept, knowing that refusing could be seen as an act of aggression, and accepting could expose them to unknown dangers. The Oracle had warned them, yes, but now a real choice appeared, a tangible decision that could define everything. The humans voted narrowly to send representatives, hoping to show goodwill without appearing weak. Ships were prepared, diplomatic envoys briefed, and fleets positioned in a protective formation. The tension was palpable. Even those who doubted the Oracle's words couldn't shake a feeling of foreboding. Something about the way he had spoken suggested that time was running out, that the core would not wait forever, and that every action had a consequence that could not be undone. When the envoys departed, the fleet watched them go in silence. The stars stretched endlessly in all directions, cold and indifferent, as if mocking the fragile humans who tried to navigate such immense scales of power. The Oracle remained behind, observing quietly. He did not leave. He did not intervene. Yet his presence seemed to fill the room with the same weight it had during the initial warning. Days passed with no incident. Reports came in from the envoys, describing the core as formal and polite, yet entirely unreadable. Their faces, or what could be interpreted as faces, showed no emotion, and every response was measured, calculated, and precise. Humans found themselves frustrated by the lack of immediate threat, wondering if the Oracle had been wrong. Perhaps they had overreacted to a species that was more disciplined than dangerous. And yet, beneath the calm exterior, the tension never fully left. Commanders double-checked their systems. Engineers ran simulations of potential attacks, and every human in the outer fleets kept a mental count of days without incident. The Oracle's warning had planted a seed that grew quietly, steadily, into a sense of inevitability. Something was coming. The question was whether humans would recognize it in time, in quiet moments. Some officers would ask themselves a question they did not dare to voice aloud. What would happen if we did strike first, even just a little? And each time, the memory of the Oracle's words returned. They will never halt. The thought was terrifying, because it wasn't just a warning. It was a truth. A truth about cause and effect, about action and consequence. About a species whose loyalty and vengeance might be limitless, even as people went about their daily duties, building, repairing, observing, and communicating. The shadow of that warning stretched across the fleet. It was a quiet pressure, a tension that made laughter a little less free and sleep a little less restful. Humans had faced danger before, but this was different. This was not a war yet, not an attack, not a battle they could see or touch. It was the weight of potential, the threat of inevitability, and the knowledge that one misstep could change everything. The Oracle, patient and silent, continued to watch. He said nothing more that day, yet humans felt his presence in the quiet corners of the command deck, in the calculated movements of fleets, in the careful tone of messages sent across the void. He had given them a choice and a warning, and now the burden was theirs to carry. And somewhere deep in the reaches of space, the core dominion continued to expand, unaware of the small human fleets that observed them, and yet already shaping their future in ways that humans could not yet understand. The stage was set. The first move had not yet been made, but the tension, the fear, and the weight of choice hung in every corridor, in every bridge, and in every mind. Humanity was about to be tested, and the Oracle's warning, made it clear that the cost of failure could be endless. The days after the first warning passed slowly, almost painfully. Humans had sent their envoys to meet the core dominion, hoping to show respect, hoping to prove that they were willing to talk. The fleets hovered in space like silent sentinels, keeping a careful watch on every sector, every possible route that the core might use to launch an attack. Every communication was checked twice, every message analyzed for hidden meaning. Tension grew quietly, but steadily. Inside the command centers, debates raged. Some argued that waiting for the core to act was a sign of weakness. "If we strike first," one officer said, "we can choose the moment, the target, the outcome. Waiting gives them power we don't have." Another shook his head. "The Oracle warned us for a reason. If we act first, we don't control the outcome. They do, and we won't like what they do next." Outside, life continued almost normally in human colonies near the contested zones. Farmers worked in artificial sunlight under protective domes. Children ran in playgrounds designed for zero gravity, and engineers repaired ships and satellites damaged by minor collisions in asteroid fields. People smiled and laughed, but the underlying fear was ever present. Every human knew that the calm could break at any moment. Despite all precautions, the debate over whether to strike first grew more intense. Humans had always prided themselves on their ability to adapt, to take risks, and to act boldly when necessary. The core dominion, however, was unknown in almost every sense. Their motivations, their limits, their strategies, everything about them was a mystery. Some commanders argued that inaction could cost more lives than a preemptive strike ever would. Others argued that inaction was the only path that might avoid a long, endless war. The young officer from the observation deck, the one who had been thinking about the Oracle's warning, felt the pressure like a weight in her chest. She understood why some leaders wanted to strike first, why some wanted to act decisively. But she also understood the fear that came from the Oracle's words, the possibility that one wrong move could trigger a response that humanity would never be able to stop. The tension was almost unbearable. Reports continued to arrive from the core dominion. The envoys described everything in meticulous detail: the way the core moved, the structure of their ships, the tone of their speech. They were precise, exact, and completely unreadable. Nothing in their behavior suggested aggression, but nothing suggested peace either. The humans listening to the reports felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief, because no immediate attack had occurred. Unease, because they had no way of predicting what would happen next. The discussions among human leaders became even more complex. Every decision now carried a weight that could affect millions of lives. Military advisors argued with diplomats. Scientists debated with politicians. Everyone had their own perspective, and everyone believed it was the most logical choice. But logic alone could not answer the question: should humans act first, or should they wait? Meanwhile, small events reminded humans that the universe was unpredictable. A minor skirmish between core scouts and a human outpost ended without serious damage, but it sparked fear. Humans speculated whether it was a test, a coincidence, or a warning. The Oracle's words echoed in their minds: if you strike first, they will never halt. Every minor incident seemed to reinforce that warning, making hesitation feel both safer and more dangerous at the same time. In the colonies, civilians began to notice the growing tension. People whispered in corridors, discussing what they had heard about the core dominion and the Oracle's predictions. Rumors spread, some accurate, some wildly exaggerated. The uncertainty created fear, but also a strange unity. Humans began to rely on each other in ways they hadn't before, sharing resources, offering support, and preparing for a crisis that might never come, or might come at any moment. The young officer spent hours each night on the observation deck, watching the stars, and thinking about the choices that humanity faced. She thought about the lives at stake, about the families in distant colonies, and about the possibility that a single decision could determine the future of an entire species. She could feel the tension building in the fleet, a quiet pressure that seemed to hang in the very air. Every time she looked at the stars, she imagined the core Dominion watching back, waiting for a move that might never come, or waiting for a move that could unleash unstoppable consequences. As the weeks passed, the debate among humans shifted. No longer was it just about whether to strike first. It became about when, how, and at what cost. Some argued for a small, targeted strike to test the core's response. Others warned that even a small strike could trigger the unending retaliation the Oracle had described. Every suggestion was weighed carefully, but every suggestion also carried a sense of dread. The core themselves remained unreadable. Their communications were formal, polite, and devoid of any emotion humans could recognize. Yet even in their politeness, there was a sense of discipline, of power, and of patience that humans found both impressive and terrifying. Every human in the fleet felt it, even if they couldn't explain it. The core were not predictable, but they were deliberate, and that made them all the more dangerous. In the Human Council, the tension reached a boiling point. Leaders knew that the longer they waited, the more difficult it would become to act decisively. But acting too soon carried risks no one could fully understand. The young officer listened to the arguments, taking notes quietly, trying to absorb everything. She had learned that sometimes the best way to lead was to listen, to think, and to wait for the moment when the truth revealed itself. Then came the day when intelligence reports suggested that the core were moving fleets closer to human-controlled space. Panic spread in the council chambers. Some leaders called for immediate action, arguing that waiting any longer could be fatal. Others reminded them of the Oracle's warning. The argument became heated, voices rising, tempers flaring, and emotions running high. The pressure was nearly unbearable. In the colonies, people sensed the rising tension, even if they didn't understand it fully. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. Workers paused in their tasks, glancing at the skies as if the stars themselves held the answer. Everyone felt the weight of a choice that was bigger than anything they had faced before. Every day felt heavier, every night colder, and every star in the sky seemed to carry a question. What would humanity do next? The young officer found herself drawn to the Oracle's previous warning again. She remembered his calm voice, a certainty in his words, and the way he had looked at the human leaders, as if he could see through them. She realized that the Oracle was not trying to frighten them. He was trying to make them understand the consequences of their actions. Every preemptive move, every act of aggression, could spiral into something humans could never stop. And yet, the temptation to act first was strong. Humans had survived by being bold, by taking risks, and by acting decisively. The idea of striking first, of showing strength, of controlling the situation before it controlled them, was almost irresistible. But the more she thought about it, the more the young officer understood why the Oracle had warned them. Acting first was not just a risk, it was a trap. Once the first move was made, the core would respond in ways humans could not anticipate. There would be no pause, no mercy, no retreat. As the council continued to debate, the young officer realized something important. This was not just a choice about strategy or tactics. It was a test of patience, of wisdom, and of understanding. Humanity could survive the core, but only if they understood the nature of their enemy and the weight of their own decisions. Acting without thought could destroy everything they had built. Waiting, observing, and understanding might give them a chance to survive and even thrive. By the end of the week, a decision had not yet been made. Fleets remained in position, envoys continued their delicate negotiations, and civilians went about their daily lives with a quiet unease. The tension had not lessened. If anything, it had grown. Humans felt the pressure in their bones, in the quiet moments between tasks, and in the endless expanse of stars that stretched around them. The young officer stood once more on the observation deck, staring at the stars, thinking about the choice that awaited them. She knew that eventually humanity would have to act. The question was when, and whether they would be ready to face the consequences. The oracle's warning echoed in her mind again, clear and unwavering. If you strike first, they will never halt. The words felt heavier each day, like a shadow growing across the galaxy. Humans were strong, clever, and brave, but they were also impulsive, curious, and full of hope. Hope was a wonderful thing, but it could be dangerous when combined with impatience and fear. Humanity was at a crossroads, standing on the edge of a decision that could determine the future for generations. And through it all, the core Dominion watched, calm, patient, and unreadable, waiting for the first move that would change everything. Every human knew, deep down, that the oracle had been right. The tension, the fear, and the anticipation were signs that the stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. The galaxy had not yet erupted into war, but the first sparks were close. The choices humans made now, the decisions about patience, courage, and restraint, would shape the path ahead. The decision came suddenly, yet it had been building for weeks. Human leaders, exhausted by endless debates and growing unease, finally agreed on a course of action. They would launch a strike against a key core forward base. It was supposed to be quick, precise, and decisive, a show of strength that they believed might prevent future threats. Fleet commanders briefed their crews with efficiency, yet behind every calm instruction, there was a tension that no simulation could capture. For those preparing to take part in the mission, the hours before departure felt surreal. Ships hummed quietly in their hangars, engines thrumming like the heartbeat of something alive. Crew members checked and rechecked equipment, supplies, and weapons, all while exchanging nervous glances. There was no overt fear, only an unspoken awareness that what they were about to do could change the course of human history. The young officer, now assigned to one of the strike ships, could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on her chest. She had spent weeks thinking, observing, and analyzing every detail of the core Dominion's movements. She had seen the tension in human colonies, heard the arguments in council chambers, and felt the unshakable warning of the oracle echoing in her mind. Acting first went against everything she had hoped humanity would do. Yet now it was unavoidable. As the fleet moved toward the core base, the vast emptiness of space seemed heavier than usual. Stars twinkled coldly in the distance, indifferent to the struggles unfolding beneath them. Humans had always looked at the stars with wonder, with curiosity, and sometimes with fear. Now they felt something more complicated, a mixture of duty, anxiety, and the faint recognition that they were about to step into something far larger than themselves. A strike fleet approached the target silently, each ship maintaining strict formation. Sensors scanned the area, mapping the layout of the core installations with precision. For a moment, everything seemed calm. There was no warning, no sign of imminent danger, no signal of hostility. The calm was unnerving, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Then the operation began. Human ships unleashed carefully coordinated attacks, disabling defense systems, cutting power grids, and targeting key infrastructure. The plan worked exactly as intended, at least in the short term. There were no major human casualties, and the core base was severely damaged. On board the strike ships, crew members allowed themselves a brief sigh of relief. For a moment, it felt like a victory, but that relief was fleeting. As soon as the operation ended, reports came in of core activity in neighboring sectors. Their response was swift, calculated, and unlike anything humans had anticipated. The core fleet had moved quickly to contain the damage, but they were not retaliating in the way humans expected. They were not panicking, nor were they fleeing. Instead, they were beginning a counter-strategy that was methodical and relentless. The Oracle's warning returned to the minds of every human leader. If you strike first, they will never halt. The words that had seemed like a distant possibility now rang with terrifying clarity. The core dominion had not reacted impulsively or emotionally. They had adapted, calculated, and were preparing to respond in ways that humans could not yet see in the following days. Humans observed the first signs of this endless retaliation. Core ships struck at supply routes, bypassing human defenses to target weak points they had carefully studied. Communication arrays were sabotaged, isolating colonies and creating confusion. Human forces, though strong and technologically advanced, found themselves constantly responding, chasing the consequences of a decision that had been intended to prevent war. The young officer watched it unfold with a sense of helplessness. She understood the logic behind the strike, the desire to act before the core could, but seeing the consequences in real time was sobering. Every response from the core seemed to anticipate human moves, striking in ways that were precise, effective, and relentless. The calm, unreadable patience of the core was far more dangerous than any obvious attack could have been. Back on the human command decks, tension grew to nearly unbearable levels. Leaders worked around the clock, coordinating fleets, managing logistics, and attempting to repair damage as it occurred. Communications were filled with reports of core actions, each one more intricate and disruptive than the last. Humans began to realize that they were no longer in control of the situation. They had acted first, and now the core were dictating the pace and scope of the conflict. Colonies near the front lines felt the pressure almost immediately. Supply shortages, delayed communications, and minor attacks on outposts created fear and uncertainty among civilians. Families whispered anxiously about the core dominion, about the fleets that moved silently above them, and about the consequences of decisions made far away. People who had once gone about their lives with confidence now faced a constant sense of unease. Every news report, every sensor alert, reminded them that humanity's choice to strike had set forces into motion that might never stop. The young officer spent long nights observing both the core fleets and human responses. She noted patterns, studied movements, and tried to anticipate the next action, but the core seemed always one step ahead. It was not mindless aggression. They were deliberate, precise, and patient. Every attack, every maneuver, seemed designed not only to retaliate, but to teach humans the consequences of acting without. Understanding in meetings with commanders, the discussion shifted from strategy to survival. Plans for counterattacks were made and revised constantly, but each action seemed to lead to new challenges. Every victory was measured, every success tempered by the knowledge that the core response was ongoing and unending. The warning of the Oracle had come true. Striking first had unleashed a chain of events that humans could not stop as the weeks stretched into months. The cost of the initial strike became more evident. Human losses, though not catastrophic at first, mounted steadily. Supply lines were disrupted, colonies suffered from isolation, and morale began to waver. Even those who had advocated for the strike began to question whether it had been worth it. The sense of control they had once believed they possessed was gone, replaced by a constant need to react to the core's relentless response. Despite the mounting pressure, humans did not give up. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair damaged systems. Strategists devised new plans to protect colonies, and diplomats sought ways to open communication channels with the core dominion. Every human involved understood that they were part of something far larger than themselves, that the decisions made in council rooms and aboard fleets could ripple across the galaxy. The young officer reflected often on the nature of the core response. They were not acting out of anger or emotion. They were acting out of principle and calculation. Every move was deliberate, every strike measured. It was as if the core had a memory of the initial attack that extended far beyond human comprehension. A memory that compelled them to continue until balance was restored in their view. In quiet moments, she thought of the oracle. His warning had been clear and precise, and now it was painfully obvious why. The strike had not merely provoked the core, it had triggered a cycle that humans were ill-prepared to control. The core retaliation was not chaotic or emotional. It was inevitable, disciplined, and unyielding. Humanity had learned, perhaps too late, that the first strike was never just a tactical decision. It was a commitment to a long, relentless struggle. Across the fleet, the sense of urgency was constant. Every command decision, every adjustment in fleet movement, every logistical choice carried weight. The human leaders understood that the core would never stop until their principles were satisfied, and that meant the conflict could stretch on indefinitely. Supplies were rationed, training accelerated, and strategies adjusted. Yet the challenge only grew. Colonists began to see the strain as well. Communities relied on each other more than ever, forming networks of support, sharing knowledge, and helping each other through shortages and minor attacks. Fear was balanced with resilience, and humans began to adapt to the reality of living under pressure. The young officer noticed that even in the face of relentless retaliation, humans found ways to endure, to survive, and to maintain a sense of hope. And yet, hope was fragile. Every day, the reminder came that the core response would never halt. Every strike humans launched, every defensive measure they implemented, seemed only to feed the momentum of retaliation. The initial strike, intended to show strength and control, had instead demonstrated a fundamental truth. In the eyes of the core, once provoked, humans had no choice but to face the consequences continuously. The young officer thought often about the future. She imagined a time when the cycle might end, when humans and core might find understanding or peace. But that future seemed distant, uncertain, and conditional on choices humans had not yet fully explored. For now, the reality was clear. Humanity had acted first, and the core were proving exactly what the oracle had warned. Even in the quietest moments aboard the fleet, the awareness of the core presence lingered. Humans had survived wars before, faced challenges that seemed insurmountable, and adapted to dangers across the stars. Yet this situation was different. The enemy was not just strong, it was deliberate, patient, and principled in ways humans had never encountered. The days after the first strike blurred into a relentless rhythm of response and repair. Humans had hoped their swift, precise attack on the core base would secure a future free from immediate threats. But they quickly realized how wrong they had been. The core dominion did not respond like humans expected. They did not panic, retreat, or even act aggressively in obvious ways. Instead, they began a pattern of relentless, calculated retaliation that seemed impossible to halt. Supply lines were the first to feel the pressure. Convoys that had once traveled unchallenged between colonies were now constantly harassed. Ships carrying food, water, and medical supplies were intercepted, sometimes damaged, sometimes captured, forcing human commanders to reroute, delay, or risk lives to keep colonies alive. The colonies themselves, though fortified, were suddenly isolated. People who had once felt safe under human protection now stared nervously at the sky, wondering if another core strike might come at any moment. Communication networks suffered next. Systems that allowed instant messages between colonies and fleets were disrupted, sometimes severed completely. Humans were forced to rely on slower, less secure methods, which added delays and created confusion. Reports of core activity arrived piecemeal, making it difficult to understand the full picture. Every decision had to be made with incomplete information, and every mistake was amplified by the enemy's precise response. The human fleets, already stretched thin, found themselves constantly in motion. Every time one sector seemed secure, a new threat appeared elsewhere. The core Dominion had adapted to every tactic, anticipated every move, and responded in ways that were disciplined, strategic, and exhausting to counter. Human leaders realized that this was not a simple war. They were facing a campaign designed to test their endurance as much as their strength. On board the ships, the crew felt the strain. Long hours, constant vigilance, and the stress of uncertainty wore on them. Sleep became irregular, meals were rushed, and conversations often turned to worries rather than small comforts. Yet even as fatigue grew, a sense of determination persisted. Humans had survived hardships before, and they knew that survival required adaptability, courage, and unbroken focus. The young officer observed the unfolding situation with a mixture of awe and concern. She could see the consequences of the first strike play out in real time. The core retaliation was not chaotic, but purposeful. Every maneuver, every strike, was part of a larger strategy that humans could only partially comprehend. The Oracle's warning echoed in her mind with increasing clarity. They will never halt. It was no longer a prediction. It was the reality she witnessed every day. Colonies near. The front lines adapted quickly to the new reality. People rationed supplies, coordinated their activities, and formed community networks to share information and resources. Schools and workplaces adjusted schedules to account for disruptions, while medical teams prepared for emergencies caused by delayed shipments or minor attacks. The human instinct to survive, to protect each other, and to maintain hope in the face of adversity became a quiet but powerful force. The core, Dominion's strategy was subtle but effective. They did not waste resources on obvious attacks. Instead, they focused on disruption. Trade routes were cut, communication channels were strained, and small but strategic targets were hit repeatedly. Each action forced humans to respond, to repair, to adjust. The cycle of retaliation seemed endless, confirming the Oracle's warning in a way that left no room for doubt. Human leaders worked tirelessly to counter the effects. Fleets were repositioned, defenses strengthened, and supply chains rerouted. Diplomats explored any possible channel for communication, hoping to understand the core strategy or find a way to reduce the intensity of the retaliation. Engineers invented new technologies to repair damaged systems faster, while intelligence officers tried to predict the next moves of an enemy whose patience seemed infinite. Despite all efforts, the psychological impact on humans was significant. Anxiety ran high, and the knowledge that the core retaliation could continue indefinitely created a persistent tension. Humans were capable, resilient, and resourceful, but even they could not ignore the reality that the conflict was unlike anything they had faced before. It was not merely about strength, it was about endurance, discipline, and an enemy that did not yield dot in quiet moments. The young officer reflected on the choices that had led to this point. The first strike, intended to prevent future threats, had unleashed consequences that humans could not control. The core Dominion's response was precise and unrelenting, and every day brought new challenges that tested the limits of human capability. She understood now that the Oracle's warning was more than a caution. It was a lesson in restraint, patience, and foresight. On the human command decks, discussions focused on survival strategies rather than victories. Leaders debated how to maintain supply lines, how to protect colonies, and how to manage morale. They knew that a direct confrontation with the core Dominion was not yet feasible. The enemy was too disciplined, too patient, and too relentless. Instead, they focused on minimizing losses, adapting to disruption, and keeping hope alive. The core Dominion, for their part, remained unreadable. Their strikes were measured, their strategies disciplined, and their actions unprovoked by emotion. Humans began to realize that the core were not seeking revenge in the human sense. They were enforcing principles, responding to the initial strike with a relentless campaign designed to ensure accountability. Every human leader, every fleet commander, and every colonist gradually understood the depth of the Oracle's warning. Once provoked, the Corps would not stop. As months passed, the human response became a delicate balance between action and caution. Every move was carefully calculated to avoid further escalation while still protecting lives and resources. Fleets moved like shadows through space, reinforcing positions where needed, repairing damage where possible, and always anticipating the next Corps maneuver. The young officer watched this unfolding effort with admiration and concern. Humanity was resilient, but the strain was immense. Colonial life continued in parallel with the unfolding conflict. Families adapted to shortages. Engineers and scientists worked tirelessly to keep infrastructure operational, and communities formed support networks to share resources and information. Fear was present, but it was tempered by cooperation and determination. Humans learned to endure, to adapt, and to maintain a sense of normalcy even as the galaxy around them became increasingly volatile. Every day brought small victories and small defeats. Human ships successfully delivered supplies to isolated colonies. Engineers repaired critical systems under pressure, and intelligence officers managed to anticipate minor Corps movements. Yet even these victories were overshadowed by the ongoing reality. The Corps retaliation never ceased. Every action humans took was met with a deliberate, disciplined response that ensured the cycle of challenge continued. That the young officer often reflected on the lessons being learned. The Corps Dominion's patience, precision, and persistence were unlike anything humans had encountered before. The initial strike had not only provoked a response, it had revealed fundamental truths about the Corps. They were methodical, principled, and unyielding. Every encounter, every strike, every repair and countermeasure reinforced the Oracle's warning. Humans could act boldly, but the Corps would never halt. In quiet moments aboard the fleet, the young officer considered the human response to this relentless campaign. Courage, resilience, and adaptability were evident everywhere. Crews worked long hours, colonies adapted, and leaders made decisions with care and foresight. Yet the strain was undeniable. Humans were facing a type of pressure they had not encountered before, one that tested not only their strength, but their patience, endurance, and wisdom. The Corps' actions had reshaped human strategy. Victory was no longer measured by territory gained or battles won. It was measured by survival, by the ability to adapt, and by the capacity to maintain hope in the face of unending challenge. Every human understood, at some level, that this was a test not just of military strength, but of character, intelligence, and resilience. The young officer often returned to the observation deck, watching the stars and reflecting on the unfolding reality. Humanity had acted first, and the consequences were immense. The Corps Dominion's retaliation was precise, relentless, and unyielding. Supplies were threatened, colonies were isolated, fleets were stretched, and the psychological toll was significant. And through it all, the Oracle's warning rang true. They will never halt. Yet even in the midst of exhaustion and disruption, humans adapted. They found new ways to survive, to repair, to support one another, and to continue their mission. They learned patience, strategic thinking, and resilience in ways that would shape their future. The first strike had unleashed a relentless force, but it had also revealed the strength, determination, and ingenuity of humanity. And so, life continued under the constant shadow of retaliation. Humans endured, adapted, and learned to live with the knowledge that their enemy would never halt. They discovered a deeper understanding of the consequences of their actions, the importance of strategy, and the necessity of patience. Every day, they grew stronger, wiser, and more resilient, even as the challenge before them ceased. Months passed since the first strike, and humanity was no longer acting with the same confidence that had carried them through earlier missions. The core Dominion's retaliation had become a constant, unrelenting presence. Fleets were stretched thin, supply lines were fractured, and colonies lived with a quiet tension that never fully disappeared. Humans were learning that surviving the core was not about strength alone. It was about strategy, patience, and understanding the enemy in ways they had never needed before. The young officer had grown into her role, observing, analyzing, and contributing to decisions that affected millions of lives. She saw how humans had adapted to constant pressure, how engineers worked tirelessly to repair damaged systems, how leaders coordinated fleets with precision despite limited information, and how colonists banded together to survive disruptions. Humanity had endured challenges before, but nothing like this. Every day tested their resourcefulness, their courage, and their ability to act wisely under pressure. It was during this time that the Oracle returned. He had been silent since the initial warning, leaving humans to navigate the consequences of their first strike on their own. But now, as the unending core retaliation continued, he appeared quietly aboard one of the command ships. There was no fanfare, no dramatic announcement. He simply stood, observing the crew, the officers, and the leaders who had grown weary from months of constant vigilance. The Oracle's eyes, calm yet penetrating, seemed to see everything. He did not need to speak loudly. His presence alone commanded attention. The young officer remembered his words from months before. If you strike first, they will never halt. That truth had revealed itself with painful clarity. Now, with the Oracle back among them, humans hoped not for miracles, but for guidance, something that could help them understand the core, manage the retaliation, and find a way to navigate the endless challenges they faced. The Oracle began to speak, not with commands, but with insight. He explained that the core were not motivated by revenge in the human sense. They were disciplined, principled, and methodical. Their retaliation was designed to enforce a kind of balance, a response to the initial strike that humanity had taken for granted. Every disruption, every attack, every strategic move was part of a larger pattern humans could barely perceive. Understanding that pattern, he suggested, was key to surviving and eventually ending the cycle. Human leaders listened carefully, absorbing what the Oracle said. For months, they had been reacting without fully understanding the principles behind the core's actions. Now, with his guidance, they began to see that the retaliation was not endless chaos, but structured, purposeful, and predictable once patterns were recognized. This realization did not make the situation easier. It only clarified the challenge, but it gave humans a framework for action, a way to regain some measure of control. The young officer took detailed notes, thinking about how the insights could be applied. Engineers could prioritize repairs to critical systems that the core were likely to target next. Fleet commanders could position ships more effectively, anticipating the enemy's strategic objectives. Diplomats could design approaches to communication that acknowledged the core's principles and perhaps ease the intensity of retaliation. Every human role suddenly had new clarity. Even if the challenges themselves remained formidable, humans quickly implemented changes. Fleets were reorganized to respond to predictable core movements. Colonies reinforced critical infrastructure, focusing resources on systems most likely to be targeted. Communication networks were rerouted to minimize disruption. Diplomats drafted careful messages that respected core principles while seeking openings for dialogue. The cycle of retaliation continued, but humans were no longer merely reacting. They were anticipating, adapting, and learning. For the first time in months, the young officer saw signs of morale improving. Not because the core attacks had stopped. They had not. But because humans had regained a sense of agency. They were no longer helpless. They could act with purpose, respond with strategy, and mitigate the effects of a relentless enemy. Even in the face of ongoing retaliation, hope began to emerge, grounded not in fantasy, but in the reality of human skill, resilience, and intelligence. The colonies themselves became centers of ingenuity. People found ways to survive supply disruptions, repair damaged systems, and maintain daily life despite external pressures. Communities organized, shared responsibilities, ensuring that critical tasks were completed even when individuals were stretched thin. Schools adapted, hospitals improvised, and civilians found ways to contribute to the collective effort. The core retaliation had not ended human life, it had transformed it, forcing humans to act in ways they had not needed to before. And in doing so, they grew stronger. On board the fleet, the young officer watched the human response unfold. Engineers coordinated repairs across multiple ships. Fleet commanders shared intelligence and planned coordinated defenses. And communication teams relayed critical updates to colonies under threat. Every action was deliberate, informed, and guided by the lessons the Oracle had provided. Humans had learned to endure under pressure, to adapt quickly, and to maintain cohesion even when the enemy's response seemed unending. Yet, the challenges were far from over. The core dominion continued its retaliation with precision, striking at points humans could not easily defend. Every day required vigilance, constant monitoring, and careful planning. Humans had to balance immediate responses with long-term strategy, ensuring that they survived while also preparing for the possibility of further escalation. It was exhausting, but it was also a test of human ingenuity, courage, and perseverance. In quiet moments, the young officer reflected on what had been learned. The initial strike had been a mistake, not in the sense of failure, but in its unforeseen consequences. Acting first had triggered a relentless retaliation that humans had not anticipated, proving the truth of the Oracle's warning. But the human response had also revealed something equally important. Adaptability, intelligence, and resilience were powerful tools in navigating even the most unyielding challenges. The Oracle's guidance continued to shape strategy. Humans began to recognize patterns in the core response, anticipate their actions, and minimize unnecessary risks. This knowledge did not end the cycle of retaliation, but it gave humans the ability to survive it, to reduce damage, and to maintain control over their own destiny. Every success, however small, reinforced the importance of careful observation, strategic thinking, and humility in the face of a disciplined and relentless enemy. Colonial life, too, reflected the lessons learned. People adapted to shortages, found creative solutions to logistical problems, and maintained social cohesion despite the pressure. Schools, workplaces, and community centers became hubs of resourcefulness, where knowledge and skills were shared freely. Humans had learned to endure, not simply survive, and to act with foresight, even when the consequences of every decision were uncertain. Through it all, the young officer continued to observe, record, and reflect. She understood that humanity had grown in ways that could not be measured by territory gained or battles won. The core retaliation had tested patience, strategy, and resilience, and humans had risen to the challenge. Every engineer, every fleet commander, every civilian contributed to a collective effort that strengthened humanity's ability to endure. Even as months of retaliation stretched on, humans learned to maintain hope. They understood that the core were not acting out of malice. They were following principles, enforcing balance, and ensuring accountability. This understanding allowed humans to act with respect, caution, and strategic intelligence. The initial strike had set a dangerous chain of events in motion, but humans were proving that they could meet the challenge with wisdom and skill. The young officer realized that the lessons of this period were profound. Humanity had learned the consequences of acting without full understanding, the power of discipline, and the value of patience. They had also learned their own strengths, the ability to adapt, endure, and act strategically, even under relentless pressure. The core retaliation had not ended human life or spirit. It had tested and refined it. By the end of this period, humans had regained a sense of control. The cycle of retaliation continued, but they could predict it, respond to it, and minimize its effects. Humans had learned that wisdom, strategy, and patience were as crucial as courage and strength. The Oracle's guidance had transformed their approach, providing insight that allowed them to navigate a challenge that initially seemed impossible. The young officer watched fleets move, colonies adapt, and leaders plan with careful foresight. Humanity had faced relentless retaliation and had not been broken. They had endured, learned, and grown stronger. The Oracle's return had been a turning point, not because he had solved the problem, but because he had helped humans understand it, and in that understanding lay hope. Humans had made mistakes, acted impulsively, and faced consequences they could not fully predict. But they had also demonstrated resilience, ingenuity, and determination. The core retaliation continued, relentless as ever, but humans had learned to survive it, to adapt, and to meet every challenge with intelligence, courage, and unity. The relentless cycle of core retaliation had stretched on for months, and yet humanity was still standing. The fleets remained in motion, colonies adapted to constant pressure, and humans continued to endure, innovate, and survive. Each day was a test, each action measured, and every decision had consequences that rippled across the galaxy. What had started as a bold, impulsive strike had become a long lesson in patience, wisdom, and resilience. The young officer had grown in ways she never imagined. She had watched fleets maneuver with precision, observed colonies withstand shortages, and seen humans adapt to challenges that would have seemed impossible before the first strike. Her nights were often spent on the observation deck, staring at the stars, reflecting on everything that had happened. The core were still out there, disciplined, patient, and unyielding. But humans had learned to act with foresight, understanding, and coordination. In the command centers, leaders gathered to review reports from fleets and colonies. Every success, no matter how small, was noted and celebrated. Every loss was studied carefully, a lesson to inform future strategy. The core retaliation had taught humans that survival was not simply about strength or speed, it was about patience, adaptability, and intelligence. This understanding allowed humans to regain a sense of control, even in the face of an unyielding enemy. The colonies themselves had become hubs of resilience. Engineers repaired critical systems under pressure. Medical teams improvised to handle shortages, and civilians organized networks to ensure that everyone had access to food, water, and information. Schools continued to educate children despite disruptions, while workplaces adapted schedules to accommodate shortages and attacks. Humans had learned to live under pressure, to cooperate in ways that strengthened their communities, and to maintain hope even in the most difficult circumstances. The young officer noted that one of the most important lessons from this period was the power of observation. The core dominion did not act randomly. They were disciplined, strategic, and principled. By carefully studying their movements and patterns, humans were able to anticipate attacks, protect critical infrastructure, and respond effectively. This was a far more sustainable strategy than impulsive retaliation, and it allowed humans to regain a sense of agency in a situation that had once seemed hopeless. Diplomats worked tirelessly alongside military strategists, searching for opportunities to communicate with the core dominion. Messages were sent and analyzed, carefully worded to acknowledge the principles that guided the core while seeking openings for understanding or negotiation. Even small gestures of respect had an impact, showing that humans were capable of learning from their mistakes and willing to act with intelligence and humility. Every successful adaptation, every small victory reinforced the confidence of humans. They realized that survival did not require eliminating the enemy or winning every battle. It required endurance, foresight, and cooperation. Humans had learned to act strategically, to anticipate consequences, and to balance immediate needs with long-term objectives. The core retaliation, though relentless, had become a framework within which humans could test and improve their abilities. The young officer often reflected on the Oracle's guidance. His warning had been clear. If you strike first, they will never halt. At the time, it had seemed like a cautionary statement, almost abstract. Now, after months of facing the unyielding core response, the truth of his words was undeniable. But more importantly, humans had learned from that truth. They had developed strategies to survive and adapt, to act intelligently under pressure, and to maintain hope even when the challenge seemed unending. Life aboard the fleets had also changed. Crew members worked in shifts that rotated constantly, ensuring vigilance at all times. Engineers repaired systems while under stress, often improvising solutions when standard procedures failed. Communication officers relayed critical updates to colonies and fleets, sometimes using untested methods to overcome core interference. Every individual contributed to a larger effort, demonstrating human ingenuity, resilience, and determination in ways that were both inspiring and necessary. Even as the core retaliation continued, humans had begun to notice patterns. The enemy's actions were disciplined, predictable to those who observed carefully. This allowed humans to plan with increasing accuracy, protecting supply lines, reinforcing colonies, and positioning fleets in ways that minimized damage. Knowledge became a weapon almost as powerful as any ship or weapon system. Humans had learned that understanding the enemy was as important as confronting them, and that patience often yielded better results than immediate action. The colonies themselves became remarkable examples of resilience. Farmers adapted their practices to ensure food production despite shortages and environmental challenges. Engineers repaired damaged power grids, water systems, and communication networks under pressure. Medical teams learned to improvise when resources were limited, while civilians organized themselves to maintain order, share knowledge, and support one another. Life continued, not perfectly, but resiliently, proving that human spirit could endure even relentless challenges. The young officer realized that humanity had learned more than survival skills. They had learned humility, patience, and foresight. They had discovered the value of careful observation, collaboration, and understanding the consequences of their actions. The first strike, though impulsive, had been a lesson in a kind of wisdom that could not be taught in schools or learned from simulations. It had to be experienced, endured, and reflected upon in the fleets. Humans began to coordinate more effectively than ever before. Different groups shared intelligence seamlessly, allowing for faster decision-making and improved protection of critical assets. Fleets moved with precision, anticipating core actions based on patterns that had emerged over months of observation. Engineers implemented rapid repair protocols, and communication teams ensured that colonies received timely updates. Humans had transformed the unyielding challenge into an opportunity to test and refine their abilities. The core dominion, though still disciplined and relentless, began to encounter humans who were no longer reacting blindly. Every strike humans took was calculated, every adaptation informed by careful observation and reflection. The core retaliation continued, but humans were learning to endure it with intelligence and strategy, turning what had once been a source of fear into a framework for growth. Diplomats continued to seek openings for understanding, sending messages that acknowledged the core's principles while carefully proposing avenues for dialogue. Even small gestures of respect had a tangible impact, demonstrating that humans were capable of learning and adapting, and that they were willing to approach challenges with intelligence rather than impulsive aggression. For the young officer, this period marked a turning point in human consciousness. Humanity had endured the consequences of their initial strike, faced a relentless enemy, and learned to survive and adapt. They had discovered strengths they had never fully realized, developed strategies for resilience, and maintained hope despite constant pressure. The Oracle's warning had been fulfilled, but humans had responded with growth, wisdom, and courage. The fleets moved as one, coordinating with colonies and outposts across the galaxy. Humans had developed communication networks that allowed rapid response, repair systems that could withstand continuous disruption, and strategies for resource distribution that minimized shortages. Every success reinforced the understanding that endurance, intelligence, and collaboration were as important as firepower or technology. Colonial life, too, reflected human adaptability. Communities organized themselves around shared responsibilities, ensuring that critical tasks were completed even under challenging circumstances. Schools, medical centers, and workplaces adapted to disruptions, maintaining a sense of continuity and purpose. Civilians contributed in countless ways, demonstrating creativity, courage, and determination that paralleled the sea efforts of the fleets in space. That the young officer often thought about what it meant to endure under pressure. Humans had made mistakes, faced consequences, and learned the value of observation, patience, and foresight. They had adapted to a relentless enemy, survived attacks, and maintained hope despite uncertainty. Humanity had learned that survival required more than strength. It required intelligence, resilience, and the ability to grow from challenges. The core retaliation, though still ongoing, had become a measure of human ingenuity. Every disruption they caused became a test of adaptability, and humans rose to meet that test. Engineers found solutions, fleet commanders anticipated enemy moves, and colonies maintained cohesion and productivity despite shortages and attacks. Every day, humans proved that their spirit could endure even in the face of an unyielding, disciplined adversary. Even as months turned into years, humans continued to adapt. They developed long-term strategies, anticipating core responses, reinforcing vulnerable points, and maintaining morale across fleets and colonies. The Oracle's warning remained true, but it no longer inspired fear alone. It inspired understanding. Humans had learned to respect the consequences of their actions, anticipate challenges, and act with wisdom, courage, and patience. The young officer realized that the first strike, Thaug,